They sent soldiers to Class 15 Hellworld. Nothing happened like they hoped. The gavel had barely finished hitting the bench when I already knew how it would end. 7 judges, 1 verdict, 0 mercy. I had been standing in that tribunal room for 11 minutes, and every second of it felt like a countdown to something I could not walk away from. The room was cold in the way that important rooms always are, the kind of cold that says the people inside it have decided they are more important than your comfort. 6 of the judges were human officers in pressed uniforms. The 7th was not human at all. Ambassador Vorith of the Galactic Coalition sat at the far right of the bench. A tall, pale creature with 4 narrow arms and 2 sets of eyes that never quite looked in the same direction. He had no expression I could read. He did not need one. He was there to observe officially. Unofficially, he was there to make sure the outcome went the way the Coalition wanted. My name is Yara Moss, Private, 3rd Penal Combat Division, United Earth Forces. Formerly a squad leader in the 9th Mobile Infantry, formerly a decorated veteran of the Kessel Station campaign, and currently the most inconvenient person in the room. Here is what I had done. During the final push at Kessel Station, my commanding officer, Colonel Holt, had issued a full retreat order while our sister units were still pinned under fire. Regulation said retreat. My gut said no. I disobeyed. I held my squad in position, coordinated a flanking move with 2 other squad leaders who trusted me more than they trusted the order, and we pulled 300 soldiers out of a kill zone before the enemy closed it. 300 people who would have died went home instead. Then the inquiry started. Because when you disobey a direct order from a colonel who also happens to be a close personal friend of Galactic Coalition, Admiral Vorith, a 3-eyed, 4-armed being with a long memory and a longer political reach, the fact that you were right does not matter very much. What matters is that Admiral Vorith had publicly predicted that position would fall, and I had publicly made him wrong. The tribunal found me guilty of insubordination, dereliction of command structure, and conduct unbecoming. They sentenced the entire 3rd Penal Combat Division, 1,200 soldiers, most of them people who had done far less than I had, to a punitive deployment. Not a prison. Something worse. They gave us Vorith IV. I had heard the name once, in an intelligence briefing 2 years ago. The officer who mentioned it had moved on quickly, the way people move on from something they do not want to think about too hard. Vorith IV was a Class 15 Hellworld designation. In the Galactic Coalition's planetary rating system, Class 1 was a garden world. Class 5 was survivable with basic equipment. Class 10 was hostile enough to require full environmental suits and heavy tech support. A Class 15, there were only 9 of them in cataloged space, was a category that existed mainly to explain why a planet had no settlers, no outposts, and no recorded survivors. Gravity was 2.3 times Earth standard. Atmospheric toxicity was rated level red, corrosive to unprotected tissue within 4 hours. Surface temperature ranged from -90 degrees at night to over 200 degrees near the volcanic vent zones. Electromagnetic storms rotated across the surface on a cycle that every probe sent there had described as irregular. Fauna threat level was extinction class. The biosphere rating was listed as active adaptive hostility, meaning the ecosystem had been observed to evolve in response to new organisms, producing new threats specifically tailored to whatever had arrived. The Coalition ambassador handed me the deployment file on the dropship. He did it with a smile that did not reach either set of his eyes. He said we were being given a chance to demonstrate our commitment to Coalition standards of conduct. I said nothing. I sat down. I opened the file. The dropship shook through re-entry, and the lights flickered, and 1,200 soldiers sat quietly around me with expressions that ranged from resigned to terrified. Outside the hull, a planet that wanted every one of us dead was rushing up to meet us. By page 3 of the deployment file, I had already found the first pattern. The electromagnetic storm cycle was described as irregular, but the data logs from the 3 unmanned probes that had lasted longer than 6 hours all showed interference spikes at intervals that were not random. Not quite regular, but not random either. I pulled out my field notebook, actual paper, actual pen, both useless to enemy jammers, and started writing. Our captain, Owen Grant, dropped into the seat beside me. He was a lean, sharp-faced man in his late 30s with the kind of calm that came not from confidence, but from having already accepted bad situations. He glanced at my notes and raised one eyebrow. "We haven't landed yet," he said. "I know," I said. He looked at the file in my hands. He looked at the notebook. He looked at me. "What are you finding?" he said. I showed him page 3. I showed him the pattern I had marked in the margins. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he took out his own pen. "What else?" he said. That was the beginning of everything. We hit the ground 40 minutes later, and the planet tried to kill us almost immediately. The landing struts cracked on impact. 2 dropships came down at a 12-degree angle because the electromagnetic interference had scrambled their guidance systems in the last 300 meters. Nobody died in the landing itself, which felt like a miracle right up until the moment 3 soldiers stepped outside with environmental seals that had not fully engaged, and the air got to them. Level red atmospheric toxicity does not give warnings. It does not build slowly. It is fast and it is not quiet, and the 3 people we lost in that first hour, Corporal Danny Fife, Private Leon Cross, and Specialist Claire Marsh, deserved better than a planet that could not wait 10 seconds to make its point. We pulled back inside. Captain Grant issued a full SEAL protocol. Nobody goes outside until every suit has been checked twice by a second person. Nobody acts alone. Nobody panics. That last order was the hardest one. There were 1,197 of us left. The coalition observers in the 2 small ships sitting in high orbit logged our first casualties and marked the time. I found out later they had a pool going. The over-under on how long before total battalion loss was set at 22 days. I spent the first 6 hours inside the primary dropship reading everything we had. Not just the deployment file. Every probe log, every surface scan, every piece of data that had been transmitted from Vorith IV before each probe went dark. There was not much. The longest any probe had survived was 9 days, and its final transmissions had been mostly corrupted. But corrupted data is still data. There are shapes inside broken signals if you look at them the right way. Dr. Nora Ockhafer found me at the end of that 6th hour. She was the battalion's senior field medic, a compact woman from Lagos who had the habit of speaking in very short sentences when she was being serious and very long ones when she was making a joke. She sat down across from me and put a ration pack on the table without being asked. "You should eat," she said. "I know," I said. I ate. "What are you building?" she asked, looking at the wall of handwritten notes I had taped to the inside of the hull. "A map," I said, "not of the surface, of the patterns." She looked at it for a long time. She pointed at one section. "These temperature readings near the vent zones. They drop at night, but they stay above livable range for about a 12-meter band around certain vent clusters. That could be shelter." I had not noticed that. I added it to the notes. That is how Nora and I started working. She saw biology and environment. I saw timing and movement. Together we started building a picture of Vorith IV that was not just a list of threats but a kind of calendar. When to move, where to go, what to avoid, and when. Owen came to us on day 3 with Corporal Finn Adler, who had grown up on a farm in rural Wales and had the particular skill set of someone who had spent years working land that did not want to cooperate. Finn could look at soil and tell you things about it that no instrument would bother to measure. He pressed his fingers into the ground outside the ship, in full suit, seals checked twice, and told us the dirt near the magnetite outcroppings was structurally different, denser, more compacted, like something had been avoiding that ground for a long time. "The fauna," I said. They do not like the magnetic interference, Finn said. Makes their navigation go sideways, probably. These deposits are natural predator repellents. We mapped every magnetite cluster within 2 kilometers. Then we extended our perimeter to connect them. By day 7, we were sleeping in rotating shifts, 4 hours on and 4 hours off, with 2 people always watching the perimeter. The electromagnetic storms came on an 11-hour rhythm that nobody had documented before because nobody had lived long enough to write it down. We wrote it down. We planned every outside movement around it. We had 11 hours between each storm window to work, gather, build, and get back under cover. By day 14, Nora had synthesized a mineral compound from local soil. She called it patch mix. That, when added to standard ration packs, was offsetting the worst effects of the atmospheric microexposure occurring even through filtered suit seals. The air was getting in microscopic amounts. Our bodies were reacting. She was getting ahead of the reaction before it could compound. Soldier Adrian Cole found the water. He was 23, had joined the penal division because of a disciplinary charge he had always maintained was unfair, and had the kind of relentless curiosity that drives some people into science and others into serious trouble. He figured out that the atmospheric condensation near the vent zones, where the toxic air mixed with a neutralizing gas the vents produced as a byproduct, created a moisture band. Collected and run through a basic filter system, it was not clean water, but it was much closer to clean water than anything else on the planet. He built the first collection trap from dropship water recycling components in 18 hours. On day 19, we saw the creature for the first time. It came out of the rocky highlands to the east, moving on 6 thick limbs with a low, rolling gait that covered ground faster than it looked like it should. It was approximately 9 meters long, with a hide that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and 2 sets of eyes, 1 pair for standard vision, 1 pair, we realized later, for heat detection. It circled our perimeter for 45 minutes. It did not come inside the magnetite line. Finn named it Gerald. That is a ridiculous name for that creature, Owen said. It looks like a Gerald, Finn said. I had an uncle named Gerald. He had the same energy. Gerald came back on day 21 and sat outside the perimeter for 2 hours. Then it left. On day 28, it came close enough that 2 soldiers raised their weapons. I told them to hold. It has not come in, I said. It keeps coming back, but it has not come in. It is figuring us out. Let it figure us out. They thought I was being unreasonably calm. Maybe I was. But Gerald never came inside the perimeter, not in 6 months on that planet. By week 4, the soldiers on watch had started keeping a separate log entry for each of Gerald's visits, noting the time, duration, and direction of approach. It gave them something to focus on besides fear, which was exactly the point. By day 40, we had mapped 42 square kilometers of surface. By day 50, the first crude structure was standing, not a dropship, not a prefab unit, but something we had built from volcanic stone, magnetite-reinforced walls, and a sealant compound Nora had developed from local mineral resin. It held heat from the vent below it. Its walls disrupted heat signatures enough to make the fauna's detection unreliable. We called it Building 1. Naming it something grand felt like tempting the planet. Building 1 was fine. The coalition observers in orbit ran their numbers on day 60. Expected casualties for that timeline on a Class 15 designation, based on every historical data point they had, ranged from 60 to 90% of deployed personnel. Their models had been built on decades of probe data and coalition biological assessments. They were considered very accurate. Our actual casualties were 31. Out of 1,197, we had 1,166 alive and functional on day 60. Their models had not accounted for Finn reading the soil. They had not accounted for Adrian's collection traps or the 11-hour storm calendar or the magnetite perimeter. They had not accounted for any of it because they had assumed we would react to the planet the way everything else did by trying to endure it until it won. We were not enduring it. We were learning it. The difference, it turned out, was everything. On day 94, we built a greenhouse. It was Corporal Pete Nwachukwu's idea. He had brought seed packets with him in a waterproof case tucked into his personal kit: wheat, spinach, a hybrid bean variety his grandmother had developed in her garden in Bristol. When he brought them to me and said he thought the soil near the secondary vent cluster, combined with Nora's mineral compound as a growth supplement, might be workable, I told him to try it anyway. 3 weeks later, the first spinach was coming up. It was small and it tasted faintly metallic from the soil, but it was real food that Vorith IV had not made. It was food that we had made on Vorith IV. There is a difference, and it matters more than I can explain in practical terms. The settlement had a real shape by day 100. Building 1 had become 3 buildings. We had a covered walkway between them, lined with magnetite fragments, that allowed movement between structures without full suit protocol in calm weather. The smelter was running on captured vent gas, producing raw iron stock that Finn and a small team were using to reinforce weak points in the outer wall. Adrian had expanded the water collection system to 5 traps, producing a combined 40 liters per day. Nora had set up a medical bay in the second building, with equipment salvaged from the dropship medkits and tools she had made herself from local materials. We had a blackboard, an actual blackboard made from a smooth slab of volcanic rock and a chalk substitute Nora had found in the mineral deposits. We used it for shift schedules, storm timing, and daily status updates. On one corner of it, someone had drawn a small picture of Gerald. I did not ask who drew it. It made people smile, and smiling was a form of survival too. On day 112, a coalition shuttle descended from orbit and asked permission to land. It was phrased as a request. It was not really a request. I gave permission anyway, because I was curious what their expression would look like when they saw what we had built. Inspector Velshareth arrived in full environmental protection gear, accompanied by 2 staff officers and a recording drone. He was a Doraki, an insectoid species, roughly human height, with 7 eyes arranged in a curve across his face and 4 articulated arms that moved independently of one another. His species communicated partly through subtle shifts in their exoskeleton patterns, and right now his exoskeleton was doing something I could only describe as deeply confused. He had expected to find desperate survivors huddled in damaged dropships, running low on everything, slowly losing ground to the planet. Instead, he found a perimeter wall, 3 standing structures, a working smelter, a functioning greenhouse, a medical bay, and 1,166 soldiers who were, on the whole, doing reasonably well. I gave him the full tour. I showed him the water collection traps and the storm calendar on the blackboard and the magnetite perimeter markers. I showed him Building 2, which we had repurposed as a combined workshop and common room, where 4 soldiers were currently playing cards at a salvaged table while 2 others worked on repairing a suit seal at the workbench. Velshareth stood in the doorway and watched them for a long moment without speaking. "This is where the recreation happens," I told him. He made a sound I did not have a translation for. I took him to the greenhouse last. Pete was in there, kneeling beside the spinach rows, working on the irrigation channel. He looked up when we came in, nodded at me, gave the inspector a brief look, and went back to work. "Your soldiers are growing food," Velshareth said. It was not a question. It sounded more like a piece of information he was trying to fit into a space where it did not quite belong. "We are," I said. "On a Class 15 world." "Yes." He was quiet for several seconds. Then he said, "How many casualties?" 31 total, I said, "since arrival." He stood very still. His 7 eyes moved in a slow rotation that I had learned, over the last hour, meant he was recalculating something. That evening, he filed his report. I did not see it then, but one of his staff officers was not as careful with a personal data device as he should have been, and I had a soldier named Cal Briggs who had grown up breaking into secure networks for fun before the military gave him a more structured outlet for that particular talent. Cal read me the key lines while Vel-Sharath's shuttle was still warming up. The inspector had written, "The deployed personnel are not surviving. They are conducting what I can only describe as systematic and enthusiastic colonization. Recommend immediate Coalition Security Council review." I sat with that for a while. Then I told Owen, who sat with it for a while too. "Enthusiastic colonization," he said finally. That is what he wrote. Owen looked at the blackboard. He looked at the picture of Gerald. He looked at Pete across the room adding notes to his planting schedule. "That seems about right," Owen said. But Vel-Sharath's report was the first crack in a wall the Coalition had built to keep themselves comfortable. The supply shuttle that had been scheduled to deliver basic humanitarian provisions, a token gesture meant to look like care without actually providing it, was quietly cancelled. The 2 observer ships in orbit were replaced by 3, then 4. They were not just watching anymore. They were measuring. Nora came to me on day 130 with something that changed everything we thought we understood about what was happening to us. She had been running weekly blood panels on the entire battalion since day 1. She laid 2 comparison panels on the table, day 1 and day 130, and pointed at the immune response markers without saying a word. Our bodies had encountered the airborne microbes of Vorith IV every day for 4 months and had not surrendered to them. They had studied them. Human immune systems, Nora explained with the controlled excitement of someone making a discovery they had not expected, are not passive. They are aggressive. They learn. They build. What the planet had been sending at us every day had not been killing us. It had been training us. "We are developing genuine resistance," she said. "Not full immunity, that would take longer, but meaningful, functional resistance. Our bodies are incorporating information from this biosphere and building responses to it in real time." "What does that mean practically?" I asked. "It means," she said, "that in another 60 to 90 days a standard filtered mask may be sufficient for regular surface exposure. Not in storm conditions, not near the vent cores, but in normal conditions." I thought about the deployment file and the way it described atmospheric toxicity as a primary termination factor. I thought about the observer ships closing their orbit. "Do not put this in any external transmission," I told her. She understood immediately. If the Coalition learned that we were not just surviving the planet's biology but actively adapting to it, becoming resistant to it, the calculation of the situation would change entirely. We were already more difficult to quietly remove than they had expected. An adapted, entrenched, resistant human settlement on a Class 15 world was a different problem entirely. A permanent one. I did not know what they would do with that information, and I knew I did not want to find out before we were ready. The Coalition held a second closed session. I did not know about it then. What I did not know but would find out later in a way that changed everything was that 2 proposals had been on the table. The first was a public acknowledgement of the deployment and a formal diplomatic negotiation. The second was something that did not involve diplomacy at all. The vote was not close. They chose the second option. They just had not told us yet. The sensor array was Cal's. He had built it over 6 weeks from salvaged dropship components, magnetite core signal amplifiers, and 2 repurposed comm arrays pulled from disabled atmospheric guidance systems. Officially, it was a weather monitoring station. Actually, it was the most capable homemade signal detection system on a Class 15 world, and on day 181, at 3:40 in the morning, it started screaming. I was awake because I was usually awake at 3:40. Vorith IV had a way of making sleep feel like a bad investment. I was at the blackboard updating the storm calendar when Cal came in from the signal room at a run. 3 contacts, he said, coming out of faster-than-light travel at the outer marker. They are big. I put the chalk down. Coalition designation. The drive signatures match coalition-registered vessels, but their approach vectors are wrong. They are not entering standard orbit. They are coming in at attack angles. Owen was up in 40 seconds. Finn was up in 60. Nora came in from the medical bay, read the room, and went straight to her supply cabinet without asking. She had a bag packed and ready. She always had a bag packed and ready. The three ships settled into high orbit 40 minutes later and opened a comm channel. The voice that came through was smooth and professional, the voice of someone who had done this before and found it straightforward. Deployed personnel on surface. This is the independent contracted vessel group operating under Galactic Coalition Resolution 77 Alpha. You are instructed to move all personnel to the eastern landing zone for immediate evacuation. You have 4 hours to comply. I looked at Owen. Owen looked at me. Cal, I said, does Resolution 77 Alpha exist in Coalition public records? Cal checked. He shook his head. There it was, a resolution that did not exist in public records, carried by ships approaching at attack vectors, offering an evacuation we had never requested on a timetable that gave us no time to verify anything. This was not rescue. The word for this was something else entirely. I pressed the comm. Contracted Vessel Group, this is Yara Moss, Senior Active Officer on the surface. Please transmit formal authorization documentation for Resolution 77 Alpha, including issuing authority and civilian oversight signature, before we begin any personnel movement. There was a pause. Then the smooth voice came back. Documentation will be provided upon arrival of ground transport. Please begin assembly at the Eastern Zone. We will wait for the documentation first, I said. Thank you. I switched off the channel. I turned to the room, which now held about 30 people, all of them awake and all of them reading the situation the same way I was. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. Owen, I said, station rotation. Everyone on duty, everyone at their post. Standard perimeter, nothing that looks like we are preparing a response. And what are we actually doing? He said. We are preparing a response, I said. What followed in the next 4 hours was the most productive and focused effort I had ever been part of. We did not have conventional military weapons capable of reaching orbit. What we had were the defensive systems we had built to protect the settlement from Vorith IV's megafauna, a captured orbital supply cache from a coalition emergency relief shipment on day 40 that we had never officially logged as received, 2 fully intact dropship engines that had never been remounted, and Adrian Cole, who at this point had been improvising mechanical solutions on a toxic Hellworld for 6 months, and had the confidence of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by what was possible. Vent pressure cannon, Adrian said, pulling up his design schematics. We built it for the fauna. Effective range is currently 200 meters. If I reconfigure the compression chamber and redirect from the secondary vent intake, I can triple that, maybe more. That will not reach orbit, Owen said. Not for direct fire, Adrian said. But the vent network has 3 surface outlets in a 2-kilometer radius. If we run the pressure through all 3 simultaneously and use them to launch a mass driver payload instead of a gas burst, the kinetic energy at the top of the launch will be significant. How significant? I asked. He told me the number. Owen made a sound. You can build that in 4 hours, I said. I can build it in 3, Adrian said. If Cal helps with the calibration and Pete stops asking questions while I am working. Pete, who had not been in the room, appeared in the doorway at that moment. I ask good questions, he said. Go build it, I said. The magnetite pulse emitters were Finn's domain. He had been expanding and refining them for months, originally to extend the fauna deterrence range. Now he reconfigured the outermost ring of emitters to broadcast in a directional cone upward, aimed at the approach vectors Cal had logged. The pulse would not damage a ship's hull, but it would play complete chaos with any targeting and guidance systems that had not been hardened specifically against Vorith IV's electromagnetic interference patterns. And why would those systems be hardened for this world? Nobody lived on Vorith IV. Nobody had ever needed to plan for an entrenched settlement fighting back, because nobody was supposed to be alive here long enough to try. The railgun was the thing that surprised even me. 2 weeks earlier, Owen had come to me with a quiet, slightly embarrassed expression and said that a small team had been working on something unauthorized in a back section of Building 3. I had told him I did not want to know what it was until it was finished, and that if anyone got hurt building it, I was going to be very unhappy with all of them. Now Owen brought me to the back of Building 3, where a device had been assembled along the length of the main corridor using the main landing strut from one of the disabled dropships, magnetic accelerator coils stripped from the 2 unmounted engines, and a power coupling that made me nervous just to look at. "Does it work?" I said. "We tested it at low power," Owen said. "It works." "How much of the settlement does it destroy if the coupling fails?" "Some of it," he said, "not all of it." "Aim it at the middle contact," I said. At hour 3, the contracted fleet came back on the channel. The smooth, professional tone had developed a sharper edge. "Deployed personnel, your compliance window is closing. Ground transport will arrive at your location in 60 minutes. Any resistance will be treated as hostile action under Coalition Resolution 77 Alpha." "We are still waiting on that documentation," I said. The channel closed. Cal, watching the orbital sensor feed, spoke quietly. "The lead ship is charging forward weapon systems." Nobody ran. Nobody froze. 6 months on Vorith IV had produced a specific kind of person, and that kind of person does not run and does not freeze. They adjust. "Power up the pulse emitters," I said. "Adrian, are you ready?" Adrian's voice came back from the vent system, slightly breathless. 3 minutes. "You have 2, I said. 2.5, he said. The lead ship fired. Not at the settlement, a warning shot, impacting the highland ridge 2 kilometers to the north. The ground shook. Dust rolled off the magnetite wall. Finn, outside on perimeter patrol, looked at the impact point, looked at the sky, and keyed his radio. "They missed," he said. "They meant to miss," Cal said. "It is a warning." "Noted," I said. "Adrian." "Ready," he said. "Finn, pulse emitters." The magnetite field went up in a directional cone, and even from inside the building the air felt different. A low hum that sat in the back of the teeth, not painful but deeply unpleasant. Up in orbit, the lead ship's targeting and guidance systems hit Vorith IV's amplified magnetic interference at a range and intensity they had never been calibrated for. The vent cannon fired 3 seconds later. All 3 outlets simultaneously, coordinated by a timing mechanism Cal had built from a salvaged flight computer. The mass driver payload, dense magnetite slugs weighted and shaped by Finn to aerodynamic specifications he had calculated by hand, left the surface at a velocity that cracked the air. The railgun fired at the same moment. The magnetic coils along the landing strut, accelerating a composite projectile in a flat arc that Owen had spent 2 days calculating for atmospheric compensation. Neither hit was precise. Neither needed to be. The lead ship's guidance was scrambled by the pulse emitters, its maneuvering systems firing irregular correction bursts that pushed it sideways into the edge of the mass driver spread. The kinetic impact was not catastrophic, but it was significant. Hull breach in the aft section. Propulsion damage. The ship dropped to a lower orbit, listing badly. The railgun round struck the underside of the second ship as it was banking to bring weapons to bear. Drive system failure, partial. The ship held position but was no longer maneuvering at full capacity. The third ship did not wait to see what came next. It jumped to faster-than-light travel without a second transmission, leaving its contracted partners behind without a word. The lead ship broadcast a cease signal 20 minutes later, engines cold, weapons powered down. Owen looked at me. They surrendered. They are asking for negotiation, I said. Get the boarding team ready. We went up in one of the functional dropships, 20 soldiers moving through zero-gravity corridors that still had emergency lighting blinking orange. The crew of the contracted vessel was 12 people. They were professional, disciplined, and completely unprepared for the reality of soldiers who had spent 6 months being trained by a Class 15 world. There was no confrontation. There was a standoff that lasted 4 minutes, and then there was a very orderly surrender. Cal went straight for the databank core. He pulled it in 40 minutes. Every file, every transmission, every encrypted order, and the encryption was Coalition Standard Grade 3, which Cal had been breaking for practice since day 90. The sealed Coalition Security Council session notes were in there. The cleanup authorization was in there. The vote record was in there. The original deployment order with the full approval chain and every name that had signed it was in there. Every single thing they had tried to make disappear was sitting in a salvaged data drive, orbiting a Class 15 world that was supposed to have solved their problem for them months ago. I sat in the captured ship's command chair and held the drive. Send a transmission to Earth Command, I said. Unencrypted, tell them to stand by. Owen looked at the drive in my hands. He looked at me. How much trouble is this going to cause? He said. Enormous, I said. He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when something was hard and necessary, and there was no other path forward. Good, he said. I did not write a careful broadcast. There was no script, no prepared statement, no diplomatic framing. I sat in the command chair of a captured vessel in low orbit above Vorith IV, with Cal running the transmission beside me, and I talked. I told them everything from the beginning, the tribunal, the deployment order, the Class 15 designation and what it meant, the first 3 people we lost before the suit sealed, the 31 names in the casualty log read aloud one by one with rank and home city, the 11-hour storm calendar, the magnetite perimeter, Gerald, the spinach, Building 1, Nora's blood panels showing immune adaptation that a coalition-designed death sentence had not accounted for, Vel Sharath's report. The closed sessions, the cleanup order, the vote. Cal played the audio from the captured databanks. The actual voices, the actual words, the actual authorization chain, every person who had signed off on sending 1,200 soldiers to a planet they expected to never see anyone come back from. The transmission went out on every open human comm relay in the sector. Cal had routed it through the captured ship's long-range array, which had a coverage radius that made our surface equipment look like a child's toy. It reached the civilian relay network at Earth within 6 hours. Within 12 hours, it had propagated across every major news channel, personal comm network, and independent broadcast platform in human space. I had no way to watch what happened next in real time. What I had was Cal monitoring the incoming signal traffic, which went from a quiet hum to something that sounded like standing next to a waterfall. Earth reacted in stages. The first stage was disbelief. The second stage was fury, not chaotic or destructive, but a cold, focused fury of the kind that comes not from panic but from clarity. People were not angry because they were afraid. They were angry because they understood exactly what had been done, and exactly why, and exactly who had decided to do it, and all of it was right there in the data for anyone to verify. The third stage was quieter and more significant. It was the stage where people stopped being angry and started being deliberate. Committees convened. Oversight boards that had been dormant for years suddenly had full attendance. Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Coalition, Dr. Petra Osai, who had spent 15 years being politely sidelined in every major coalition decision, walked into the coalition Foreign Relations building and put the full transmission record on the table in front of the session chair without saying a single word. She did not need to say a word. The coalition session that followed was, by all accounts, the most fractured in the organization's history. 37 member species were represented. For the first 2 hours, the debate was mostly internal: blame assignment, damage control, attempts to reframe what had happened as a misunderstanding or a rogue action by a few unauthorized individuals. Those attempts failed quickly. Because the authorization chain in the captured databanks was clear and complete, and bore the signatures of 3 sitting council members and 2 senior military advisors. Then the Tharun delegation asked to speak. The Tharun were a species humanity had encountered early in its coalition membership and had never quite managed to connect with. They were large, scaled, slow-moving, and spoke rarely. They had a history that most coalition members preferred not to discuss openly. 200 years ago, they had been offered coalition membership under terms that were cooperative on paper and deeply restrictive in practice. They had spent a century navigating political invisibility before a constitutional change gave them genuine representation. They remembered what it felt like to be underestimated. They remembered what it felt like to be treated as a problem to be managed rather than a people to be heard. Their senior delegate, Vorith IV, stood at the speaker's podium and said very few words. He said that the Tharun had watched the transmission from Vorith IV with specific attention. He said that his government's position was that the deployment had been a deliberate act of attempted elimination, that it had failed because the species targeted had behaved in a manner consistent with their nature, and that the coalition's instinct to view that nature as a threat was not a security assessment but a failure of imagination. He said that the Tharun government was formally requesting a bilateral cooperation agreement with Earth's government, effective immediately, independent of the coalition framework. The room was very quiet when he sat down. 2 other delegations, the Surath, a quick-moving species that had always maintained careful neutrality, and the Deep-Ocean Kelari, who communicated through translated biological signal and rarely spoke in open session at all, both signaled support for the Tharun position. In 24 hours, the coalition's quiet anti-human bloc had lost 3 members, and it had not finished losing. By the time I arrived at the coalition summit chamber, the political landscape had already shifted 3 times. I came with Owen, Nora, Cal, Finn, Adrian, and Pete. All of us in Vorith IV field gear, not entirely because we were making a point, although we were, but also because it was what we had. Clean, repaired where needed, but unmistakably the gear of people who had lived on a Class 15 world for 6 months. The gravity adaptation was visible in how we moved. 6 months at 2.3 times Earth standard had changed our posture, our build, the way we held ourselves in a room. In the coalition chamber's standard gravity, we felt noticeably light. The room was full, a lot of eyes. I had developed the habit on Vorith IV of noting the direction and number of eyes watching me at any given moment, because on that planet that information kept you alive. The habit did not turn off just because I was standing in a political chamber instead of a magnetite-walled settlement. I walked to the podium. I had 3 things to say, and I said them. The first was that the United Earth Forces Battalion, designated as 3rd Penal Combat Division, required formal public acknowledgement of the deployment order's true nature, not as a punitive military posting, but as a deliberate act of directed elimination, and a full, unredacted release of the authorization chain to Earth's civil government. No private settlement, no sealed document, no internal review, public, complete. The second was that humanity required a permanent, equal seat on the Coalition Security Council, not an observer position, not a consultative role, a full seat with full voting rights and full access to classified security deliberations. If the Coalition's concern was that humanity was difficult to manage, then managing us from outside, the room had clearly not been working. The third was simple. Vorith IV was to be formally designated a human protectorate under Coalition territorial law. There was a sound in the room when I said that, not quite laughter, not quite disbelief, something between them. I waited for it to settle. The planet tried to eliminate us, I said. We stayed. That creates a relationship. We are keeping the planet. Vorith IV of the Tharun made a sound that his translator converted to a short burst of audio. It took me a moment to understand that it was amusement. Tharun amusement was a deeper sound than I expected. The session that followed lasted 4 days. Most of it was handled by Dr. Osai and a team of Earth legal advisors who arrived on the second day, and proceeded to demonstrate that humanity had been quietly preparing for exactly this kind of negotiation for some time. I found that deeply satisfying. I sat in a waiting area outside the chamber with Owen and drank a beverage from the coalition catering that was technically coffee adjacent and ate from a ration pack I had brought from the settlement because the coalition food had nothing I recognized. On the third day, Velshareth found me in the waiting area. He stood in the doorway for a moment, his 7 eyes moving in that recalculating rotation. Then he came in and sat across from me with the careful deliberateness of someone choosing to have a conversation they were not required to have. "You know what I wrote in my report," he said. "It was not a question." "Enthusiastic colonization," I said. His exoskeleton shifted in a pattern that might have been embarrassment. It was an accurate description. "It was," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When I arrived on the surface and saw what your battalion had built, I experienced something I did not have a word for. My species does not have a word for it. I had to search through human language archives afterward." "What did you find?" I asked. He said the word carefully, testing the pronunciation. "Awe," he said. "I believe it was awe." I thought about building one and the blackboard and the picture of Gerald and Pete's spinach growing in volcanic soil, and Adrian's vent cannon, firing 3 outlets at once, and the railgun that Owen had quietly let happen in the back of Building 3. "That seems about right," I said. He left without another word. I thought we understood each other for the first time. The agreement was signed on day 4. All 3 terms were met, with one modification to the Security Council seat that assigned us to a newly created subcommittee on frontier territories, which was, in the end, a more powerful position than the standard seat would have been, because frontier territories were exactly where humanity was going to be living and working and making itself difficult to ignore for the next several generations. Dr. Os looked quietly pleased when she explained that detail. She was very good at her job. I was appointed governor of Vorith IV in the same signing session, under the new human protectorate designation. It was a title that nobody had held before, for a world that nobody had survived before, and it came with exactly 0 additional resources, a classification as a frontier territory requiring further development assessment, and a formal coalition notation that read, in translation, "Ongoing environmental challenges." I thought that was a fair description. We went back 3 weeks later on a properly equipped transport, the first one Earth had sent, carrying supplies, additional personnel, communication infrastructure, and a formal survey team that spent the entire journey asking me questions I was happy to answer. Owen sat beside me on the flight deck going over the resupply manifest. Finn was in the cargo bay with his agricultural expansion plans, which he had been drafting since day 60, and which were now 43 pages long. Adrian had submitted a 16-page engineering proposal for a permanent vent energy capture system that the survey team was treating with the respectful attention of people who understood they were dealing with someone who had built a working railgun from a landing strut. Nora had published her findings on human biological adaptation under sustained Class 15 exposure, and the medical community's response had gone from complete disbelief to a very rapid reassessment of long-held assumptions about human biological limits. She had been offered 4 research positions and a university chair. She had declined all of them and was in the cargo bay finishing a follow-up paper. Cal was designing the next version of the sensor array and had already given it a name. He called it Station 1. We came in at dawn. Vorith IV's dawn was a specific kind of event. The sky moved through 7 distinct color shifts as the star rose above the eastern ridgeline, from a deep bruised purple through amber, and then a yellow-white that was too bright to look at directly. The volcanic vent plumes caught the light and turned orange along the horizon. It was, genuinely and without any sentimentality, beautiful. The settlement was visible from the air. 3 buildings had become 7. The perimeter wall stretched nearly a full kilometer of magnetite-reinforced barrier. The greenhouse had a second module. The smelter was running. Along the northern edge of the perimeter, a small group of soldiers on morning watch were standing at the wall. And just outside it, at the border of the magnetite line, Gerald was there. He had grown. 6 months had added visible mass to his frame, and his 6 limbs were settled in that low, patient stance I knew well, the one he used when he was not threatening anything, just present. The soldiers on watch were not raising weapons. One of them had her arms folded, watching him the way you watch something you have come to understand. Another had a notebook and was writing something down. The transport settled onto the landing pad Adrian's team had poured from smelted iron and volcanic aggregate on day 160. The ramp came down. I walked out first. The air hit me immediately, the filtered, faintly metallic air of Vorith IV, carrying the trace of vent gas and something mineral and deep that I had come to associate with early morning on this specific, impossible planet. I was wearing a standard filtered mask. Not a full suit seal, just a mask. The soldiers at the northern wall saw me, and there was a sound, not a cheer exactly, more a collective exhale of something that had been held in for a while. Finn walked past me down the ramp with his agricultural plans under his arm and went directly toward the greenhouse without stopping. Owen stood beside me, looking out at the settlement. "Governor," he said, trying the word out. "Do not," I said. He smiled. He had been smiling more in the past 3 weeks than in the 2 years I had known him before Vorith IV. I walked to the northern wall. Gerald watched me approach. He did not move. I stood at the magnetite line and we looked at each other for a long moment. This enormous 6-limbed creature who had first circled our perimeter on day 19 and kept coming back, who had in some manner that defied easy explanation become a part of what this settlement was. I took a ration bar from my pocket and held it out. He ate it. The soldier with the notebook wrote something down. I glanced over and saw she had headed the page with Gerald's name and below it 2 words, Resident, Year 2. I walked back to Building 1 and put my bag down and looked at the blackboard. New information had been added since I left. Storm calendar updates. Water trap output increases from the 5th station. Pete's second crop report. A smelter maintenance schedule. And Cal's Station 1 signal coverage map spreading out from the settlement in a radius 3 times the size of the original array. In the corner, the drawing of Gerald was still there. Someone had added a careful detail beneath it that had not been there when I left. Below the picture, in small neat letters, the name and then a second line reading Resident, Year 1. I thought about the tribunal room. I thought about the cold and the gavel and the ambassador's smile that did not reach either set of his eyes. I thought about the deployment file handed over like a document that already knew its own ending. They had sent us to a Class 15 Hellworld. They had sent us without real resources, without any intention that we return, and with every confidence that the mathematics of the place would handle the rest. They had designed every detail of it to be a sentence with only one conclusion. The problem was that they had been thinking about it as an ending. Every calculation they ran, every model they built, every closed session they held, and every quiet vote they cast was built on the assumption that what they were dealing with was a problem to be removed, a variable to be zeroed out. They had never seriously considered the possibility that we would look at the worst place in the catalogued galaxy and start taking notes. Not because we were reckless, Not because we did not understand the danger. We understood it completely. We read every page of that deployment file and we knew exactly what we were walking into. We understood it and we showed up anyway because showing up is what we do. Because when humans encounter something that is hard and hostile and wants them gone, something deep and stubborn inside us does not say we should leave. It says we should understand this better. It says, where is the pattern here? It says, where is the water? It says, I wonder if anything grows in this soil. They sent soldiers to a Class 15 Hellworld and hoped we would disappear. Instead, we named the storms and mapped the minerals and learned the fauna and built walls and grew food in volcanic ground and turned the planet's own defenses skyward when they sent ships to finish what the planet had not managed to start. We did not win because we were stronger than the planet. We won because we were more stubborn than their expectations. We won because they saw a death sentence, and we saw a problem that needed solving. We won because Finn understood what soil was saying, and Adrian understood what pressure could do, and Cal understood what signals were hiding, and Nora understood what our bodies were learning. And because Owen trusted all of them, and I trusted Owen, and somewhere inside the logic of all of that, 1,166 people came home from a place that had never sent anyone home before. Vorith IV, Class 15 Hellworld, Human Protectorate. Year 2 started the next morning.